The late autumn sky over the Utah Territory stretched like a gray canvas torn by wind, with clouds so dark they seemed to press down on the red rock canyons and sage-covered valleys below. Ayanna Running Brook clutched her infant son closer to her chest as the first fat raindrops began to fall, each one cold enough to make her shiver despite the deerskin wrap that covered them both. At 19, Ayanna had already learned that life on the frontier tested even the strongest spirits, but nothing had prepared her for this. 3 days ago she had been with her band, traveling their traditional autumn route, toward winter shelter in the protected valleys south of the Great Salt Lake. Then the sickness had come, a fever that struck the elderly and the very young with devastating speed. Her son, Little Wolf, had been among the first to fall ill. While the medicine man worked his healing ceremonies and the women prepared traditional remedies, Ayanna had made a desperate decision. The white settlement of Cedar Ridge, still 2 days' journey away, was rumored to have a doctor, a man who might possess medicines unknown to her people. Against the protests of her family and the explicit orders of the war chief, she had taken her sick baby and set out alone, driven by the fierce desperation that only a mother watching her child suffer could understand. She had hoped to reach the settlement before the storm that had been building on the horizon for days finally broke. Now, as thunder rumbled across the Utah wilderness like the voice of angry spirits, Ayanna realized she had badly miscalculated both the distance and the speed of the approaching weather. The baby in her arms was burning with fever, his tiny body racked by coughing fits that seemed to tear at her very soul. Her own strength was failing after 3 days with little food and less sleep, and the storm promised to be the kind that could kill even experienced travelers caught in the open. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the rocky outcroppings and bending the tough sagebrush nearly flat. Rain began falling in earnest now, driven by gusts that felt like icy needles against Ayanna's exposed skin. She pressed her back against a large boulder, trying to use her own body as a shield to protect Little Wolf from the worst of the weather. "Stay strong, my little warrior," she whispered in Apache to the bundle in her arms, though her son was too fevered to respond to her voice. "Your mother will not let the storm take you." But even as she spoke the brave words, Ayanna could feel her body beginning to tremble with cold and exhaustion. Her deerskin clothing, already soaked through, provided little protection against the dropping temperature. Worse, she could see no shelter anywhere in the barren landscape around her. Just endless miles of rock, sage, and now the growing fury of a mountain storm. Lightning split the sky overhead, followed immediately by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the earth itself. In that brief moment of illumination, Ayanna caught sight of something that made her heart leap with hope. A thin tendril of smoke rising from beyond a low ridge, barely visible against the dark sky. Where there was smoke, there were people, and where there were people, there might be mercy for a desperate mother and her dying child. Summoning the last of her strength, Ayanna pushed away from the boulder and began fighting her way through the storm toward that distant promise of shelter. Each step through the storm felt like a battle against the very forces of nature. The wind howled with such intensity that Ayanna had to lean forward at an almost impossible angle just to make progress, while the rain came down in sheets so thick she could barely see more than a few yards ahead. The rocky ground, already treacherous in good weather, had become slippery and dangerous as water ran off the stone surfaces in rushing streams. But it was the cold that threatened to defeat her. The temperature had dropped rapidly as the storm intensified, and Ayanna's wet clothing now felt like ice against her skin. Her hands, wrapped protectively around Little Wolf, had long since lost most feeling, and she could feel her legs growing weaker with each stumbling step. The baby in her arms had grown ominously quiet, his fevered struggles replaced by a stillness that terrified her more than his earlier distress. She pressed her ear close to his tiny chest, relief flooding through her as she heard the faint but steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He was still alive, but barely, and time was running out for both of them. "Just a little further," she gasped, though whether she was speaking to her son or to herself she couldn't say. "The smoke?" There was smoke. The ridge she had seen in the lightning flash seemed impossibly far away now, and Ayanna began to wonder if the smoke had been real or just a desperate hallucination, born of hope and desperation. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and her own strength was nearly spent. Several times she stumbled and nearly fell, catching herself at the last moment with reflexes born of a lifetime spent in harsh country. It was during one of these near falls that she saw it again. Not smoke this time, but the faint yellow glow of lamplight filtering through what looked like the windows of a building. The sight gave her a surge of energy she didn't know she still possessed, and she forced her frozen legs to carry her forward across the last stretch of open ground. As she drew closer, the structure resolved itself into a substantial log cabin with a steep-pitched roof and a stone chimney, from which the blessed smoke continued to rise. Beside it stood a large barn, its doors secured against the storm but clearly built to shelter animals and equipment from exactly this kind of weather. Ayana reached the cabin's covered porch just as her legs finally gave out completely. She collapsed against the heavy wooden door, her remaining strength only sufficient to produce a few weak knocks that she feared would never be heard over the storm's roar. But someone inside must have heard, because after a moment that felt like an eternity, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. A voice called out from the other side of the door, a man's voice, speaking English words she didn't understand but whose tone suggested caution mixed with concern. The door opened to reveal a large man silhouetted against the warm light from within. Ayana looked up at him through eyes blurred by rain and exhaustion, seeing weathered features, graying hair, and blue eyes that widened in surprise as they took in the sight of an Apache woman, and baby collapsed on his doorstep in the middle of a raging storm. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man's gaze shifted to the bundle in Ayana's arms, and something in his expression changed. Without saying a word, he stepped forward and carefully helped her to her feet, his strong hands gentle despite their obvious power. "Come in," he said, his voice carrying an accent she didn't recognize, but speaking in careful Apache that told her he had learned at least some of her language. "You and the little one," coming out of the storm. The warmth of the cabin hit Ayana like a physical force as the rancher helped her through the doorway. After hours in the freezing storm, the heated air felt almost overwhelming, and she swayed on her feet as her body began to react to the sudden change in temperature. The, man, who appeared to be in his 50s with the weathered hands and steady bearing of someone who had spent his life working the land, immediately guided her toward a chair near the stone fireplace where a substantial fire crackled and sent dancing shadows across the log walls. "Sit," he said gently, switching back to English but accompanying his words with gestures that made his meaning clear. "You're safe now." Ayana sank gratefully into the chair, her entire body shaking as warmth began to penetrate her soaked clothing. But her attention remained focused entirely on little Wolf, whose silence continued to terrify her. She carefully unwrapped the deerskin bundle, revealing her son's small, fevered face and the rapid, shallow breathing that spoke of serious illness. The rancher took one look at the baby and immediately moved into action. "Stay here," he said, disappearing into another room and returning moments later with an armload of thick wool blankets. "We need to get you both warm and dry." He handed her the blankets with a respectful gesture that suggested he understood the delicacy of the situation. A white man alone with an Apache woman and child in circumstances that could easily be misunderstood by those who chose to judge without knowing the full story. "I'll step outside while you change," he said, his Apache halting but sincere. "Take all the time you need." The kindness in his voice brought tears to Ayana's eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since beginning this desperate journey. She nodded gratefully and waited until he had stepped onto the porch, before carefully removing her wet clothes and wrapping both herself and little Wolf in the warm, dry blankets. When the rancher returned, he carried a steaming bowl that filled the cabin with the most wonderful aroma Ayana had smelled in days. "Beef stew," he explained, setting the bowl within her reach along with a spoon and a chunk of fresh bread. "You need to eat to keep your strength up for the little one." Ayana hesitated, years of caution about accepting food from strangers warring with her desperate hunger, and the practical knowledge that she would be no good to her son if she collapsed from starvation. The rancher seemed to understand her conflict, because he ladled a spoonful of the stew into his own mouth first, a gesture that demonstrated both the food's safety and his respect for her wariness. "My name is Samuel Morrison," he said as she began to eat with careful, measured bites. "I've lived in this valley for 12 years now. Never had trouble with the Apache people, and I don't intend to start tonight." Between bites of the nourishing stew, Ayana studied her unexpected host. Samuel Morrison appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a working rancher whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face spoke of honest labor. His cabin was comfortable but not luxurious, filled with practical furniture and the tools of frontier life. Everything about him suggested a man who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. "I am Ayanna Running Brook," she said finally, her English heavily accented but clear. "This is my son, Little Wolf. He is very sick." Samuel nodded gravely, moving closer to examine the baby with the careful attention of someone who had dealt with illness in isolated conditions. "High fever," he observed. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days, Ayanna replied. "Getting worse. I was trying to reach Cedar Ridge." "The doctor there?" "Dr. Patterson," Samuel said immediately. "Good man. And he's helped Apache folks before when they've needed it. But Cedar Ridge is still a day and a half away, and this storm isn't going to let up before tomorrow afternoon at the earliest." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. Little Wolf might not have another day and a half to wait for medical attention, but as if he had read her thoughts, Samuel continued with quiet determination. "But I've got some experience with fevers in children, and there are things we can try here. My late wife, God rest her soul, was something of a healer herself. Left me with some knowledge and a few remedies that might help." The mention of his deceased wife explained both his gentleness with children and his respectful treatment of a grieving mother. Ayanna felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she realized she had found not just shelter from the storm, but genuine help from someone who understood loss and healing. "Will you let me try to help your son?" Samuel asked softly. Looking into his kind eyes, Ayanna made a decision that would change more lives than she could possibly imagine. "Yes," she whispered. "Please help him." Samuel Morrison moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had faced medical emergencies in isolation before. From a wooden chest that had clearly belonged to his wife, he withdrew several small bottles, clean cloths, and what appeared to be a collection of dried herbs carefully preserved in glass jars. "First thing is to bring down the fever," he explained as he worked, his voice calm and reassuring. "High temperatures can be dangerous for little ones, but there are ways to help the body cool itself safely." He prepared a basin of lukewarm water and showed Ayanna how to use damp cloths to gently cool Little Wolf's fevered skin. The baby stirred at the touch of the cool cloth, a faint whimper escaping his lips, the first sound he had made in hours. "That's good," Samuel said encouragingly. "He's responding. Now, my wife always said that willow bark tea could help with fevers, but it's too strong for babies. Instead, we'll try something gentler." From one of the glass jars, he withdrew what looked like dried flower petals. "Chamomile," he explained. "We'll make a very weak tea and see if we can get him to take a few drops. It should help calm his system and might bring the fever down a bit." As they worked together over the next several hours, Ayanna found herself amazed by Samuel's knowledge and gentleness. He seemed to understand instinctively that healing was as much about comfort and care as it was about medicines, and his manner with Little Wolf was both competent and deeply compassionate. "You've done this before," Ayanna observed, as they took turns monitoring the baby's breathing and temperature. Samuel nodded, his expression growing distant. "My wife and I, we were never blessed with children of our own, but we helped birth and tend plenty of babies for neighbors over the years. Martha had a gift for healing, and she taught me what she could before the consumption took her." The quiet pain in his voice told Ayanna that Martha Morrison's death was still a fresh wound, despite the years that had passed. She understood that grief, the kind that never fully healed but taught you to find meaning in helping others avoid similar losses. "She would be proud of what you're doing tonight," Ayanna said softly. "I hope so," Samuel replied. "She always said that kindness was the first medicine, and that the rest was just knowledge built on top of caring." Throughout the long night, they maintained their vigil. The storm continued to rage outside, with wind and rain battering the cabin's sturdy walls, but inside the atmosphere grew increasingly hopeful as Little Wolf showed gradual signs of improvement. His breathing became less labored, his fever began to break, and several times he opened his dark eyes to look up at the faces watching over him. "He's beautiful," Samuel said during one of these lucid moments, when Little Wolf managed to grasp one of the rancher's large fingers with his tiny hand. Strong spirit like his mother. Ayanna felt tears of relief and gratitude flowing down her cheeks. For the first time in days, she began to believe that her son might survive this illness, But more than that, she was overwhelmed by the kindness of this white stranger who had opened his home to them without question or condition. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you helping us? Many of your people would not." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the baby who had finally fallen into what appeared to be restful sleep, rather than the fevered unconsciousness that had terrified them earlier. "Because," he said finally, "I believe that when someone shows up at your door in the middle of a storm with a sick child, you don't ask questions about race or politics or anything else. You just help. That's what decent people do." As dawn began to break outside, painting the storm-washed landscape in shades of gold and pink, Ayanna reflected on the extraordinary night they had shared. She had set out on this desperate journey expecting at best indifference and at worst hostility from any white settlers she encountered. Instead, she had found genuine compassion and skilled care from a man who asked nothing in return except the chance to do what was right. But as the morning light grew stronger, the sound that had been building in the distance for the past hour became unmistakable, the thunder of many horses approaching at speed. Her people had found her. The drumming of approaching horses grew steadily louder as the storm finally began to clear, leaving behind a landscape washed clean and gleaming in the early morning sunlight. Ayanna's heart began to race as she recognized the distinctive rhythm. This was not the casual approach of travelers, but the purposeful advance of a war party moving in formation. Samuel heard it too. He moved to the window and peered out through the glass, his expression growing grave as he took in the sight that was emerging from the morning mist. "How many?" Ayanna asked, though she dreaded the answer. 30, maybe 40 warriors," Samuel replied quietly. "All mounted, all armed, and moving like they mean business." Ayanna closed her eyes and clutched Little Wolf closer to her chest. She had known this moment would come, had known that her father, Chief Standing Bear, would never let his daughter's disappearance go unanswered. But she had hoped for more time to get Little Wolf to safety and perhaps find a way to explain her actions that wouldn't result in bloodshed. "They're looking for you," Samuel observed, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Ayanna admitted. "I disobeyed my chief's orders when I left to find help for my son. They've come to bring me back, and me?" Samuel asked with the calm of a man who had faced danger before and survived through clear thinking rather than panic. "I don't know," Ayanna said honestly. "My father is a good man, but he has lost face because of my actions." "The war chief. He sees any contact with white settlers as betrayal of our people's safety." Samuel nodded thoughtfully, then moved away from the window to check the load in his rifle, not with the frantic haste of fear, but with the methodical care of a man preparing for whatever might come. "Samuel," Ayanna said urgently, "you should go. Take your horse and ride for Cedar Ridge. I'll tell them you were gone when I arrived, that I sheltered in your barn without permission." "No," Samuel replied firmly. "I won't leave you to face this alone, and I won't lie about what happened here. You came to my door seeking help for your child, and I gave it. If that brings consequences, then I'll face them standing up." The sound of hoofbeats was very close now, and through the window, they could see the first riders emerging from the trees that bordered Samuel's property. The sight took Ayanna's breath away. These were some of the finest warriors of her people, mounted on horses that moved like the wind itself, their weapons and war paint gleaming in the morning sun. At their head rode a figure she knew well, Greyhawk, the war chief who had argued against her marriage to a man from outside their band, who had opposed any accommodation with white authority, and who now had the perfect excuse to prove that contact with settlers led only to trouble. But behind Greyhawk, riding with the dignity that befitted his status as a chief, came her father. Chief Standing Bear was a man in his 50s whose wisdom and judgment had kept their people safe through years of increasing pressure from territorial authorities. The expression on his weathered face was unreadable, but Ayanna could see the tension in his posture that spoke of a leader facing a crisis that could have far-reaching consequences for his people. "That's my father," she told Samuel, the man in the eagle feather headdress. "If anyone will listen to reason, it's him. But the one leading them? Greyhawk has been waiting for an excuse like this." The war party had reached the fence that marked the boundary of Samuel's property. They sat their horses in perfect formation, weapons ready but not yet raised in direct threat, waiting. "What happens now?" Samuel asked. "Now," Ayanna said, standing and moving toward the door. I face the consequences of my choice, and we find out whether the kindness you've shown will be repaid with honor or bloodshed. As she reached for the door handle, Little Wolf stirred in her arms and opened his dark eyes. For the first time in days, they were clear and alert, and he gazed up at his mother with the wondering look of a child who has returned from the edge of darkness. The sight gave Ayanna the courage she needed to step outside and face whatever judgment awaited. Ayanna stepped onto the porch with Little Wolf in her arms. Samuel closed behind her. The morning air was crisp and clean after the storm, but the tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife. 40 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect semicircle around the cabin, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready. Chief Standing Bear urged his horse forward a few paces, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene. His daughter safe and obviously well cared for, her baby alert and healthy in her arms, and the white rancher standing respectfully but without fear beside them. My daughter, the chief said in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. You have caused great concern among your people. I know. Father, Ayanna replied, also in Apache, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. I chose to save my son's life over obedience to commands. I would make the same choice again. Greyhawk's horse stamped impatiently as the war chief leaned forward, his face dark with anger. You endangered our entire band with your selfishness, he snarled, running to the white man's door like a beggar, exposing our location and our weaknesses. I saved my child's life, Ayanna shot back, her maternal instincts overriding years of training to defer to war leaders. Little Wolf was dying. Would you have me let him die to preserve your pride? Better that than to put our whole people at risk. Greyhawk's hand moved toward his weapon, but Chief Standing Bear raised his own hand in a sharp gesture that commanded stillness. Peace, Greyhawk, the chief said firmly. We will hear the whole story before making judgments. Samuel had been listening to the exchange in Apache, understanding more than he could speak. Now he stepped forward slightly, his movement careful and non-threatening but clearly signaling his intention to be part of this conversation. Chief Standing Bear, he said in his halting Apache, your daughter came to my door during the great storm. Her baby was very sick and she was very afraid. I helped because it was the right thing to do. The chief studied Samuel with keen eyes that seemed to take in everything. His honest bearing, his respectful tone, the way he stayed close enough to Ayanna to show support, but far enough away to avoid any suggestion of impropriety. You know my daughter's name, Standing Bear observed. She told me, Ayanna Running Brook, and the little one is Little Wolf. Samuel's pronunciation of the Apache names was careful and respectful. I know also that she is the daughter of a great chief, and that she risked much to save her son. And what do you want in return for this help? Greyhawk demanded suspiciously. Land rights? Trading privileges? Safe passage for your cattle? Samuel's answer was immediate and firm. Nothing. I want nothing except to know that a child who was sick is now well, and that a mother who was desperate has found hope. The simplicity of his response seemed to surprise even Greyhawk, who had clearly been prepared for negotiation or demands. Chief Standing Bear dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward the porch, his approach deliberate but non-threatening. May I see my grandson? He asked gently. Ayanna descended the porch steps and carefully placed Little Wolf in his grandfather's arms. The baby, now fully alert and clearly much improved, gazed up at the chief with curious dark eyes and made the soft cooing sounds of a healthy infant. Chief Standing Bear examined his grandson with the expert eyes of a man who had raised many children and grandchildren. The baby's clear eyes, steady breathing, and responsive movements told the story of a child who had been pulled back from the brink of serious illness through skilled and dedicated care. He is well, the chief said softly, a note of wonder in his voice. Yesterday when you left, I feared we would never see either of you alive again. Today you both returned to us healthy and strong. He looked up at Samuel, who waited quietly on the porch. This man's medicine worked where ours could not? His medicine and his kindness, Ayanna confirmed. He asked for nothing, promised nothing, and gave everything that was needed. Father, this man saved your grandson's life. Chief Standing Bear handed Little Wolf back to his daughter and walked up the porch steps until he stood face to face with Samuel Morrison. For a long moment, the two men studied each other, representatives of two cultures that had so often been at odds, brought together by circumstance and united by their shared respect for the sanctity of life. Then, to everyone's amazement, Chief Standing Bear extended his hand in the white man's gesture of respect and friendship. "I am in your debt, Samuel Morrison," he said in careful English. "You have given me back my daughter and my grandson. How can such a debt be repaid?" Samuel took Chief Standing Bear's offered hand without hesitation, his weathered face reflecting both relief and genuine respect. "No debt, Chief," he said firmly. "What I did, any good man would do. The fact that your daughter trusted me with her child's life, that's honor enough for any man." Greyhawk had dismounted as well, his expression still skeptical as he approached the group on the porch. "Pretty words," he said in heavily accented English, "but words are wind. How do we know this white man will not ride to the territorial authorities and report our location? How do we know he will not bring soldiers to our camps?" The question hung in the air like smoke, highlighting the fundamental distrust that existed between the two peoples after years of broken treaties and betrayed promises. But Samuel's response was immediate and unwavering. "Because I give you my word," he said simply, "and because any man who would betray a mother who came to him for help would be no man at all." Chief Standing Bear studied Samuel's face intently, using the skills of a lifetime spent reading the character of men under pressure. What he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "I believe you speak truth," the chief said, "but belief alone does not ensure safety for my people. Greyhawk's concerns are not without merit." "Then let me prove my intention," Samuel replied. "Your daughter mentioned that you were traveling toward winter shelter when the sickness struck. If you need a place for your band to rest and recover while the sick ones heal, my valley has good water, shelter from the wind, and grass for your horses. You're welcome to use it for as long as needed." The offer clearly surprised everyone present, including Ayanna. It was one thing to help a desperate mother and child in an emergency, quite another to invite an entire Apache band to camp on one's property, especially given the current tensions between territorial authorities and native peoples. Greyhawk's expression shifted from suspicion to outright astonishment. "You would invite 40 warriors and their families to camp beside your home? Are you fool or saint, white man?" "Neither," Samuel replied with a slight smile. "Just a man who's lived alone in this valley for 12 years and learned that good neighbors are more valuable than distant authorities. Besides," he added, looking at Little Wolf in Ayanna's arms, "I owe this little warrior a debt of my own." "What debt?" Chief Standing Bear asked, genuinely curious. Samuel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Since my wife died 5 years ago, I've been lost, going through the motions of living without really understanding why. Last night, helping your daughter save her son, I remembered what it felt like to matter, to make a difference in someone's life. That's a gift I can never repay." Ayanna felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in Samuel's voice. She had sensed the loneliness in this kind man, but hadn't realized how deeply her trust had affected him. Chief Standing Bear turned to address his warriors in Apache. "Greyhawk speaks wisdom when he warns of the dangers of trusting too quickly. But I have looked into this man's heart and I find it clean. He offers what we need, a safe place for our sick ones to recover and time to decide our next path without pressure from enemies." "And if he betrays us?" Greyhawk demanded. "Then we will deal with that if it happens," the chief replied calmly. "But I do not believe it will. Sometimes, Greyhawk, we must choose between the fear of what might happen and the hope of what could be." The war chief was clearly not entirely convinced, but his respect for Chief Standing Bear's judgment was absolute. After a long moment, he nodded grudgingly. "If the chief decides to accept this offer, then we will honor his decision. But I will post guards, and at the first sign of treachery, you'll do what warriors do," Samuel finished. "Protect your people. I wouldn't expect anything less, and I wouldn't respect you if you did less." Greyhawk studied Samuel with new interest, recognizing a man who understood the realities of frontier life and the responsibilities of leadership. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "you are not the fool I thought you were." "High praise from a war chief," Samuel replied with genuine warmth. "I'll take it as a compliment." Chief Standing Bear looked around at the faces surrounding him, his daughter holding his healthy grandson, the white rancher who had risked everything to help them, and his war chief slowly learning to see beyond old prejudices. "Then it is decided," he announced. We will accept Samuel Morrison's offer of shelter while our sick ones heal, and our scouts find the safest path to winter camp. And we will remember that not all bridges between our peoples need to be burned. As the Apache warriors began to disperse to bring news of this decision to their band, Ayanna approached Samuel with Little Wolf in her arms. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, "for my son's life, for your trust in my people." "No thanks needed," Samuel replied, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "But I hope this little one grows up in a world where such thanks aren't necessary, where people help each other because they're all human beings first, and everything else second." Looking around at the scene unfolding in his valley, Apache and White working together in mutual respect, Ayanna began to believe that such a world might actually be possible. 3 weeks later, Samuel Morrison's valley had been transformed into something unprecedented in the Utah Territory, a place where two worlds existed side by side in harmony. The Apache band had made their temporary camp along the creek that ran through the heart of his property, their lodges arranged in the traditional pattern, but positioned to take advantage of the natural windbreaks and fresh water that made the location ideal for recovery and rest. The sickness that had driven Ayanna's desperate flight had been controlled and gradually eliminated through a combination of traditional Apache healing methods and the practical, frontier medicine that Samuel had learned from his late wife. Little Wolf had become the perfect symbol of this cooperation, a healthy, laughing baby who delighted equally in his grandfather's stories and Samuel's wooden toys. "He's going to be a strong one," Samuel observed as he watched Little Wolf attempt to crawl across a blanket spread in the sunshine outside his cabin. "Takes after his mother." Ayanna, who had grown comfortable enough with their unusual host to speak freely about her hopes and fears, smiled as she guided her son's explorations. "My grandmother says he has the spirit of a leader. She thinks he might grow up to be a bridge between our peoples." "Could be," Samuel agreed thoughtfully. "World's changing fast out here. Maybe it's time for leaders who can see beyond the old divisions." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention toward the main trail, where a small group of riders was making its way toward the valley. But these weren't Apache warriors. The silhouettes and riding style were distinctly different. "Territorial authorities," Samuel said grimly, recognizing the military bearing of the lead rider. "I've been expecting this." Chief Standing Bear emerged from his lodge and walked calmly toward the cabin, his presence commanding even in this moment of potential crisis. Greyhawk appeared beside him, hand resting casually but meaningfully on his weapon. "How many?" the chief asked quietly. 6 men, Samuel replied. "Probably a sheriff and a federal marshal with an escort. They'll have heard rumors about Apache camping here and come to investigate." "Do you want us to leave?" Ayanna asked, her voice tense with the knowledge that their presence could bring serious trouble for the man who had helped them. "No," Samuel said firmly. "We all knew this day would come. Time to find out whether the law can recognize the difference between a war camp and a healing camp." The riders approached slowly, their leader raising his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. As they drew closer, Samuel could see that his assessment had been correct. The man in front wore a federal marshal's badge, while his companion carried the star of a county sheriff. "Samuel Morrison," the marshal called out as they reached the cabin. "I'm Marshal Davidson, and this is Sheriff Watts. We need to talk." "Light down," Samuel replied courteously. "Coffee's hot if you're interested." Marshal Davidson was a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes that took in every detail of the scene before him. The Apache lodges, the peaceful atmosphere, the obvious signs of cooperation rather than conflict. "Mr. Morrison," he began carefully, "we've received reports that you're harboring hostile Indians on your property. That's a serious federal offense." "I'm not harboring anyone," Samuel replied calmly. "I'm providing temporary shelter to a band of peaceful Apache while their sick recover." "There's a difference." "Is there?" Sheriff Watts interjected, his tone more aggressive than the marshal's. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you've got a war party camped right on your doorstep." Chief Standing Bear stepped forward, his dignity intact despite the potentially dangerous situation. "I am Chief Standing Bear," he said in excellent English. "These are my people, and we are not a war party. We are families seeking shelter while our children heal from sickness." Marshal Davidson studied the chief with professional interest. "Chief Standing Bear, I've heard of you. Your band has a reputation for avoiding trouble with territorial authorities. We seek only to live in peace and raise our children safely, Standing Bear replied. Mr. Morrison offered us a place to rest while the sick ones recovered. We accepted his kindness gratefully. Sheriff Watts still looked uncomfortable with the arrangement. Marshal, are you sure this is wise? Setting precedents like this. Sheriff, Davidson interrupted firmly. What I see here is exactly the kind of peaceful cooperation that Washington wants to encourage. Two communities finding ways to coexist without conflict, helping each other through difficult times, building trust instead of suspicion. This isn't the problem. This is the solution. Gray Hawk, who had been listening intently to the entire exchange, stepped forward. This trading license, it would protect Mr. Morrison from punishment for helping us. It would make everything completely legal, Davidson confirmed. As long as all parties comply with the terms of the agreement, there would be no federal interference with the arrangement. Then we accept, Chief Standing Bear said immediately. If such an agreement protects our friend and allows us to formalize our gratitude for his assistance, we welcome it gladly. Samuel grinned broadly. Marshal, if you've got those papers with you, we can get this settled right now. I've got witnesses, willing participants, and a damn good story to tell about why this arrangement benefits everyone involved. As the afternoon progressed, Samuel Morrison's cabin became an unlikely diplomatic center, where federal law met Apache tradition and found common ground. The trading license was signed and witnessed, creating the first legally recognized partnership between a white settler and an Apache band in Utah Territory. But more than legal documents were created that day. As Marshal Davidson and Sheriff Watts prepared to leave, carrying news of this successful experiment back to territorial authorities, Little Wolf chose that moment to take his first unsteady steps, walking not toward his mother or grandfather, but straight toward Samuel Morrison. Well, I'll be damned, the marshal said softly, watching the baby's determined progress. Kid knows who his friends are. Samuel knelt down and caught Little Wolf as he completed his journey, lifting the laughing child high in the air. That's right, little warrior, he said in Apache. We're all family here. Looking around at the faces surrounding him, Apache and white, official and civilian, old and young, Samuel realized that what had begun as a simple act of compassion on a stormy night had grown into something much larger. They had created a model for how different peoples could live together in mutual respect and support. You know, Marshal Davidson said as he mounted his horse, Washington's been looking for success stories to include in their reports to Congress. I have a feeling this little valley is going to become famous as an example of how things ought to be done out here. As the officials rode away, carrying news of the Utah Territory's most unusual trading partnership, Ayanna approached Samuel with tears of gratitude in her eyes. You've given us more than shelter, she said softly. You've given us hope that our children might grow up in a world where kindness matters more than the color of one's skin. Samuel looked down at Little Wolf, who was contentedly chewing on a wooden toy horse carved by Apache and white hands working together. Maybe, he replied, this little one will grow up to build even more bridges than we've managed. The world's changing, and it's going to need leaders who understand that we're all stronger when we help each other than when we stand apart. As the sun set over the Utah Valley, where two worlds had learned to exist as one, the future seemed full of possibilities that none of them could have imagined when a desperate mother knocked on a stranger's door in the middle of a storm.